Managing the Pandemic, How New Zealand Got It Right. Welcome to this occasional series brought to you by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow here at the Green School, and want to welcome you to this latest edition of the Dorothea Green Lecture Series. Today's session is part of a series of virtual seminars looking at how various countries are handling the pandemic, and today we look at New Zealand. Joining us to discuss the situation there is Dr. Michelle Dickinson. With a PhD in biomedical and materials engineering, Michelle is a passionate researcher and teacher with a love of science and engineering. She is also a best-selling author and renowned TV and podcast host. Also joining us is Ambassador Mark Gilbert, who's Vice Chairman, Private Wealth Management of UBS, the global financial services company. 2014, President Obama nominated Mark to serve as U.S. Ambassador to New Zealand and Samoa. And prior to his banking career, he played professional baseball for 8 seasons, reaching the major leagues with the Chicago White Sox in 1985. And Mark will definitely come back to that at the end of this session. While we are still in the very early days of the pandemic, New Zealand has set an example for many countries on how to handle the crisis. In a country of some 4.8 million people, it is recorded, according to latest statistics, some 1,153 cases and only 21 deaths. Every death is a tragedy, of course, but that's a stunning number compared to many other countries. Prime Minister Ardern has won huge plaudits for handling of the crisis. Indeed, New Zealand has virtually said that it has declared victory over the virus. Michelle, let's turn to you there on the ground in New Zealand and ask you, what is the status of the epidemic there, or the pandemic, and what steps has the government taken to address it, and how effective have those steps been?
Yeah, kia ora, David. Welcome to New Zealand. We are feeling very lucky right now. We have come out of lockdown. We've been out now for a couple of weeks. We currently only have 1 case that's in hospital. We now have 35 active cases in the whole country, and we are pretty much back to life as normal as much as it can be, with a little bit of social distancing. So we are feeling very unique in the world, in able to have our businesses go back and actually have some of our freedoms back. It's been an incredible experience. Yet for many people, they may know that New Zealand probably had the toughest lockdown criteria anywhere in the world. So New Zealand decided to act early. It decided to communicate really well with the public. We were very clear about what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, and what was coming, so people could plan, so they didn't have to panic by not knowing what was going to happen next week. And we locked down where the only things that were allowed to open were supermarkets and pharmacies. No takeaways. You're not allowed to go outside of your house unless you were an essential service worker or walking around the block once a day for your health. And we did that for 4 solid weeks. And for us, and the citizens abiding by that, actually meant that we were able to really get a hold of the virus, eliminate the virus, and now are living relatively free again.
And how would you describe, were there protests, were there criticism, opposition to what the government put in place for its policies at all?
You're always going to get critics. There are always going to be people, and criticism is good, right? Because debate is actually good to make sure that there's thorough thought behind what's going out. So the nice thing that this government chose to do, and Jacinda Ardern led it, was communicate every day to the people. The data was transparent. The data was honest. We knew exactly who our cases were, where they'd come from, and how they were linked to clusters, and whether or not transmission was happening. By the public having all of this data every single day at 1 p.m., we were able to see how the decisions were being made and then agree or disagree with them, but also know what evidence was being used and what models were being used. And so we really took a scientific process and gave it to the public and said, here's the data, here's the modeling that we're doing, this is why we're making these decisions. And in doing that, the public, I think, felt very informed and very much part of the journey. Now, we knew that things would change as science kept changing every day, and we were learning more about the virus. And so our behaviors had to change around social distancing, and you know, our schools are back now, and we had to make those decisions. But I think the general population, and we've seen it in the polls, Jacinda's ranks have gone through the roof. The recent polls have shown that this country has pretty much supported her, and those who would have probably voted for opposition have now moved towards her leadership during this time. So I think during the pandemic, actually we had great leadership, great communication, and the public as a general really appreciated that.
Mark, it's been a few years since you served as ambassador in New Zealand, but let me ask you, is there anything that surprises you about either the way the government has handled this or about the way the people of New Zealand have responded to it?
No, not at all. And I want to go back to something Michelle just said when she was talking about getting the data on a regular basis. And we here were able to listen to Prime Minister Ardern's press conferences and listen to her talk to the people. And you could tell she was taking the current data, making decisions, and doing what she, the cabinet, felt were right for the people of New Zealand. And you saw that it worked out. One of the things you learn, whether it's business or government or just everyday life, it's those people who have the ability to take information, figure out what it means, react quickly, and make those decisions who end up being successful. And that's why the Prime Minister, the government, and all of New Zealand has been successful because of how quickly they took the data and dealt with it.
And what lessons can we take from New Zealand's handling of this and apply, not necessarily here in the United States, but in other countries? What would you say?
Well, I think it just goes to show that having competent government that makes decisions based on science and data, on facts, and does it quickly can make a world of difference. When you look around the globe and you look at the countries that acted quickly, got testing in place, were able to trace, when other cases, popped up, those are the countries that have had fewer cases, fewer deaths, and they'll be able to open up significantly sooner than those countries that don't have those things in place.
Michelle, could you talk about the role that medical experts and scientists have played in the government's response and getting information out there?
Yeah, it's been a huge role actually, and experts have been brought in based on their needs. So towards the end, the modelers have come in, New Zealand modelers have come and looked not just at the spread of the virus, but also the spread of economic inequality based on obviously job losses and other things. So we've had a lot of great scientists do local modeling on what our economy is looking like and who it's affecting, as well as virus spread. Also, communicators like myself have been brought in to communicate to the public to make sure that the government message was clear, but also that the scientific evidence that we were using was clear and transparent, so people knew which models we were using, people knew where we were getting our data from and what we were classing as data and what we were classing cases. New Zealand was unique in that we didn't just count the number of cases that were confirmed, we also counted probable cases, meaning that their positive tests hadn't come through yet, but they are likely to be a case, to make sure that our numbers were actually realistic rather than just the things that we actually tested as our metric. So we used a lot of scientists with lots of different expertise, and we presented those to the public and said, this is the person who is representing this, and this is why, and this is their expertise. And there's always going to be debate and opposition with that. So we had a couple of infectious disease specialists and academics who actually had opposing views. And that's okay, that's science, that's what we do. And then there was the public debate about where their data was coming from, what models they were using, and how that was representative to New Zealand, which is a relatively small country. And so we have to make sure that the data isn't being compared to countries that didn't actually have similar demographics to us. So science certainly was all over the news, which was fabulous as a communicator. And we were really talking at quite a high scientific level to the public who came on a journey with us. And I think that really helped New Zealanders to feel what we were doing.
And was there any demonization, maybe is a little too strong a term, but here in the United States, as I'm sure you're aware, Dr. Anthony Fauci was one of the main people put out from the medical field. And there was a meme going around, fire Fauci. In fact, even President Trump retweeted that. Any kind of attacks against the medical experts in New Zealand that's comparable?
No, no, because we're just not those, no. The data was really clear, the evidence that we're using is clear, and what was honest and transparent was that we don't know the answers, but we're doing our best with the data that we have. And actually every day we may make a different decision based on what we learned yesterday. And we took people through the scientific process of how it works. And we took people through the process of the fact that other scientists are going to debate us, and that is needed because that's how good decisions are actually made. And I think that journey and that communication around how science works, which the majority of people don't know because it's, you know, it's crazy what we do as academics, you know, the peer review and the infighting is actually really good for us to make sure that we've really thought about how we've done this and that we've done this well. We're having to do this on a daily basis with all of the new data coming in for COVID. So we didn't get that. So of course, there's going to be opposition. Of course, there's going to be fringe social media groups. We have all of those. There are going to be those who said, herd immunization should be where we go. I read it in some blog and therefore we should, you know, all of those conversations happened. But the majority of New Zealand and New Zealanders said, I trust the experts and I trust that you know how to debate this and I trust that you're going to lead us in the right direction for our country. And yeah, we follow.
Mark, if I can come back to you and ask, as I understand it, New Zealand has also had imposed some travel restrictions, restricting entry into the country. And that has been something that President Trump has touted here in the United States as reducing the number of exposures. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you weigh those issues, because it obviously has a huge economic impact on countries as well.
Well, our travel restrictions here haven't been anything like they were in New Zealand. You know, the president talks about the travel ban with China, but from the time that he put in the ban, 400,000 people traveled from China to the United States because not everybody was banned, and people, not like in New Zealand where you had to go into a quarantine, you know, came into the country. But by the time that was done, it was already too late for here. I currently sit on or part of two organizations that does work with New Zealand. One is the U.S.-New Zealand Council, which works on the government relationship between our two countries. And I was also asked to sit on a committee of the think tank who's already trying to figure out, you know, what's next for New Zealand. How do we build our business, you know, in the post-COVID-19 world? And yes, New Zealand had great successes, which is the most important thing, but one of their big businesses is tourism. And having foreign business people traveling between their country and New Zealand has come to a halt. So how do you keep the country going economically in a period of, you know, you had the virus contained, but if you open back up, then you're susceptible to, you know, people coming in from countries where the virus is not contained. And I think that's going to be the most difficult thing for New Zealand. But there are many creative people. I mean, I'd asked Michelle about how she took and redid her entire business in less than 72 hours because she knew what she had planned for the next 2 years could not possibly happen. And that's really the key. I was lucky. I spent more than a decade of my life as an institutional sales trader, where the idea was you got information, you figured out what it meant, and you dealt with it as quickly as you could in a smart, reasonable way. The people who've been able to adapt and to change their businesses and figure out how I'm going to do things in the post-COVID-19 world are the ones that are going to be successful. But I'd ask Michelle about transitioning an entire business in 72 hours.
Sure. How did you do it, Michelle?
So, you know, I think we had a lot of data coming in that the world is changing. The world is changing very quickly. And as a business owner who has employees, it was very clear to me the majority of our company is around global events. So we tour live science education products around the world. It became very clear to me that was not going to exist as a market for at least a year. And so we had to be quick and nimble and say, what is our value proposition and how do we turn our whole company around? But also, I have a privilege of coming from a tech background. I'm an engineer, I know how to code, I've kept those skills updated, so I was able to move to a digital platform and code that very quickly, as well as build a production studio and all the other things we had to do at the last minute. But I think that the survivors in this business are going to be those who are nimble, those who are agile, and those who are okay with big change. And this is where we've talked for a long time about how understanding technology and upskilling in technology is a crucial skill of the future. And we talk about these future-ready skills. They've all seemed to have come into place now. People are learning how to video conference and where the mute button is and all the other things. Those are the skills that actually I think are really going to help businesses to survive and trade internationally through digital means right now, as we figure out what, and as each country tries to figure out what they do internally and when they can recover and how they're going to recover on their own.
So let me ask both of you, maybe starting with you, Michelle, because you're there on the ground, the economic impact of the lockdown that was put in place. Obviously, we're still in the early stages of emerging from that. If you could give us a picture of the impact of that, and then Mark, if you could also weigh in on the impact on New Zealand, but also with the whole region.
Yeah, so I mean, we're in a petri dish. We don't know. We know that there's going to be significant economic impact. Tourism is a massive part of our economy, and that's been totally cut dry. So we know it's going to hurt. Predictions right now are looking at, they've said 10.4% predicted economy being smaller at the end of 2020. That's come from ANZ. That's sort of where we're looking at. Here's what happened in New Zealand. The second that we announced that we were going into lockdown, our government offered a wage subsidy of 80% of our current wage, give or take, for 12 solid weeks. We're still in that 12-week period, so people can still pay their bills. I think as we come out of that and businesses have started to lay people off, Air New Zealand, our big national carrier, just laid off half of their air staff. So, we've got highly trained pilots and flight attendants and crew losing their jobs because air travel has totally been decimated. So I think we're just starting to see what the consequences are. New Zealand is one of these places where we just roll our sleeves up and get on with it. So I think we're going to see a lot of transitions in businesses very quickly as now our economy is open. Our film and TV industry is a massive part of what we do. We're filming the new Lord of the Rings thing. And what the big American producers seem to be doing is flying their people in now to do their 2 weeks quarantine so that they're ready to actually have a full production shoot for these multi-million-dollar businesses and movies in New Zealand. And so I actually think we're going to get a lot of celebrities moving here very quickly as they try and produce content. So I think the economy is going to change a little bit. I think we're going to do what we do well, which is film and TV, and we do agriculture really well. And tourism is going to have to probably rethink how they do that. And so, yeah, we're adjusting. Economy is going to be hit everywhere in the world. Because we're one of the first countries to recover. I'm really optimistic about how we'll do things differently here.
Right. Mark, if you could assess how New Zealand's ability to bounce back from this, but then maybe take a step back and look at a bigger picture.
Sure. Well, as Al said, we're already working on that. As I mentioned earlier, I'm working on with two organizations that I'm part of, trying to figure out how to make that work. Those who have the ability to do things, through e-commerce are going to be much quicker to bounce back than those who need that personal. If you're in a restaurant and you have to serve someone a meal, it's very different than if you can email somebody a document. So those businesses are going to come back significantly slower. When Michelle was talking about the intellectual capital going to New Zealand, I believe New Zealand will be able to attract a lot of people in a lot of industries, and something, maybe with tertiary education. Having students that can't have the on-campus experience here in the United States come to New Zealand, quarantine for 2 weeks, go on to their university, and however long the pandemic is still with us, to spend time there where they can have a real, college life, college education, interact with people. Some of our universities here have said we're going to go back in the fall with social distancing and other parameters, and others have already announced it's going to be a virtual education. So it's going to be different in whatever field you're in, what part of the country that you're in. And the other thing that I talk about that is not New Zealand specific, although it may have some meaning there. But here, I believe a lot of the businesses that will not come back may not have survived the next decade anyways, because of the trends that we were seeing in the economy. What the pandemic did is it sped up those shortcomings that those businesses had. But like anywhere else, anytime you lose a business, it's tough. And with as many people, we now have 39 people who have filed for 39 million people who have filed for unemployment. And the prior decade, we had only grown 22 million jobs. So it's going to take a long time, in my opinion, for the global economy to come back.
And can you also talk about New Zealand's approach in terms of any stimulus efforts coming from the parliament and the government versus, say, what some other countries are doing in a comparative sense?
Yes, so our economic stimulus has been around so first of all, the wage subsidy, which was taken up by most businesses. So you had to prove that at least 30% of your business income was affected by COVID, which was pretty much every company in New Zealand. And then what was really lovely, so I'm a business owner and we applied for the wage subsidy, and we applied on a Tuesday and the money was in our bank by Thursday morning for our whole business. Wow. And I could pay every employee for the next 12 weeks. And that reassurance as a business owner meant that I could just roll my sleeves up and figure out what was next for my business. That really changed things for us. And I'm seeing lots of stories of other businesses around the world saying there's a package, but we don't know how to apply for it. Then you have to be audited for it. We had money in 48 hours and 12 weeks runway money. So that, I mean, it didn't pay our rent, but it meant I had enough in the bank to just be able to think and get my employees to work on what's next. I think that was really important. And now, you know, our budget has just been announced and we're investing in the things that are important. Some of the things that we're investing in are, we know there's going to be some job losses. So really important things like more free school lunches for kids, really help to make sure that the younger generation aren't going to be affected by, you know, food poverty and some of the important things. So there's a big economic stimulus package. As always, the opposition have come in and said it's too much money, you know, our kids are going to be paying this for the rest of their lives. But all of our economic stimulus is around helping people to keep their jobs right now so that we don't have this big drop. And the other thing that we're trying to do is use technology and partner with countries that we are going to classify as safe. So travel is a big part of our economy. And we know that Australia actually has dealt with the virus very well too. And the Australian tourism sector to New Zealand is a large proportion of the tourists that come through. So we're now working on ways to partner with countries that we trust, and, you know, Trans-Tasman, so Australia is probably going to be one of those, to open up our borders. So there's free trade between countries that have dealt with the virus well and dealt with it early that we can trust. And we'll probably have some technology within that, some sort of contact tracing that works between countries so that we can monitor where you've been, make sure you've been in that country of origin for at least 2 weeks. So that was your quarantine period before you come here. So I think we're going to start to see some real allegiances through different countries, and those who open their borders to each other and those who close their borders to others.
And Mark, if I can take advantage of your expertise and experience and ask you to look at the global economy, I realize that could take a whole session in itself, but if, and this is a huge if there is no major second wave of the pandemic, do you have a rough sense of how long it will take some major countries to bounce back from this?
Michelle talked about something that I believe is critically important. She talked about the security that people felt by what the government did. And that's not the case all around the world. That there are people that don't know where their next meal's coming from. I mean, we literally have had 2-mile long lines of people in their car waiting to pick up food. I believe there are going to be so many side effects from the pandemic itself, and I don't mean physical, but I mean mental side effects. People out of work, people not having food, people who don't have daycare for their kids because now they're able to go back to work, but their children's school is not open. So because of that, all of those side effects, I believe it's going to take significantly longer than what people believe. And I don't think that the world has really addressed that appropriately. One thing that they're more able to do in New Zealand than we are here in the US, because with a country of 5 million people, it's easier than a country with 330 million people, where you can figure out who is hurting, who needs help at a much easier level than you can when you're just trying to throw money at a problem. The first stimulus bills that were passed, it was disproportionate how it went to different people, where there were huge companies that probably had the money to survive this, it received huge sums of money, and then small businesses who were denied money the first wave because they ran out. So they had to wait for another one to pass, and in that interim time, they didn't know, what do I do with my employees? Am I going to be able to pay them? There are a lot of things that I think still have to be worked out. It's going to take really smart people, and like Michelle likes to talk about, science, to figure out how to do this in a very smart way. And my belief is you're going to have states in our country that are winners and those that are losers. And the ones that have really good, smart government, I think will come out of this in much better shape. And we'll have to wait and see. But I believe this is something that's going to be with us much longer than people think.
And Michelle, let me ask you, how concerned are people in New Zealand about the possibility of a second wave, of a return, whether in the fall or our fall, your fall? How concerned are people there?
Look, everybody is concerned about a second wave, and we've seen it in other nations. But the advantage of New Zealand closing down its borders and having this 14-day quarantine means that a second wave would only come if we let people in who have it and we don't control that. And so I think because we've been able to learn what's happened with other countries, and we've been able to see things like in Singapore, where their second wave was actually because they weren't monitoring certain types of demographics of people, we've been able to learn a lot from that and put those policies in place. So I'm carefully optimistic that actually by using the evidence from other countries and other nations and learning from that and being really careful around our borders and our quarantine systems, that, touch wood, we hopefully won't have a second wave anytime within this next year.
Mark, let me ask you about China, which obviously plays a huge role in all of this, the pandemic starting in China. But there is growing Chinese pressure on other governments to resist any investigation that would point the finger back at the Communist Party and authorities in Beijing. How do you see this dynamic playing out?
It's going to play out in multiple ways. First of all, China, being as much of a closed society as it is in government controlled, there's not much influence the outside world is going to be able. Look what's happening at the WHO, where the US doesn't go to a meeting, and who becomes the featured speaker but President Xi. They said, we're going to give you $2 billion. And what happens when that happens? All of a sudden, the governments around the world decide, well, maybe we don't necessarily need to investigate, what happened. China has been taking advantage of what has happened. I still stay in contact with people around the region. And one thing that we've heard from so many of them is that we did not realize how dependent we were on China until the pandemic happened. So because of those dependencies, particularly in the smaller countries, you're not going to see much of a pushback. As a matter of fact, you're going to see exactly the opposite. You're going to see them become much closer to China and to be getting their funding from China and so on. So unfortunately, I think the pandemic, when you look at geopolitics going forward, China is going to be the big beneficiary, although we all know that the virus started there.
And Michelle, is New Zealand feeling pressure from Beijing on the political and geopolitical issues related to the pandemic?
Yeah, and obviously there's been resistance. And New Zealand, the Ministry of Health here came out with an official statement that we are supporting a review of what happened, including the origin of the virus. So we are publicly saying that we will, support investigations into what happened in China and the origins of that. But it's a really delicate situation, and we are a small nation, and actually we require a lot of things from China for our economy. And so I think it's going to be a very sensitive issue. And I just think that we have to weigh up a whole bunch of things before we make decisions to go verbally against what is a massive trading nation for us.
Do you have a sense that, Michelle, if I can start with you and then turn to Mark, that democracies in the Asia-Pacific region are working more effectively and closely together as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, our proximity, not just by distance, but also through, technology and being able to make sure that our governments are talking about what technology we're all using and the ability to be able to share the technology streams so that if we do open our borders to each other, there's a way to actually have our systems work together has been very different to how we would have done it before. And we've become very close to Singapore, for example, as a nation that physically isn't as close, but population size and demographics is relatively similar. So I really do think we've almost closed our doors to Europe and the US for now, because it does we just seem to be looking at them going, I don't know what's going on over here. But, Taiwan and some of the other nations really seem to have got control of the virus. We're definitely partnering with those much more closely.
And Mark, if I can ask you, President Trump seems to be going after China, blaming it for starting this whole crisis. Do you have a sense that there is an administration approach and strategy and policy toward reaching out to countries like New Zealand to work more effectively together in an alliance?
So not being part of the administration, it would be hard for me to speak to that specifically. But I think the one thing that we should all learn from this is that having relationships, good relationships like we have with New Zealand, become so much more important when you have a crisis like this. And one of the things that I think that we have to look at post-COVID-19 is that how we continue to build on those relationships, because they should not just be a military relationship or an intelligence relationship. It should be a relationship that we trade with each other, that we create protected supply chains. Many countries around the world get many of their drugs, many of their critical materials that go into things that are of national security interest to those different countries that come from China. So what happens if you say, okay, we're going to investigate you, and they say, okay, all of these parts or all of these drugs that you need, we're going to cut off. So I think like-minded countries like the US, New Zealand, Australia have to talk about how are we going to create these critical supply chains? How are we going to trade with each other in a way that allies should trade with each other versus thinking just of a trading agreement?
So let me come to the last question for each of you, and start with you, Michelle, if I can. A lot of people are eager for the return of sports to society. And rugby, I guess what you would call football, we probably call soccer. What's the outlook there in the sports world?
I think it's going to change. We used to have, hundreds of thousands sometimes of crowds of people to come and watch. And we've seen the rise now of virtual spectatorship around sports. It's not the same, we know that. I think sports is going to take a really big hit, especially contact sports where you are exchanging body fluids just as part of the game. And rugby is about as close contact as you get here in New Zealand. I think we're gonna have to rethink what it is, what it means to us, and how we participate in it, and also how we view it. I don't see it coming back anytime soon, sadly. Maybe sooner in New Zealand, now that we tend to have got control of the virus. But like many countries, a lot of our players have come from offshore. It's a very international game, and you have to compete with people who come from other places. One of our clusters in New Zealand, our first cluster, was actually a rugby team. It was a military rugby team that had been playing in the States, and they came back, and the majority of them were infected when they came back. And so I think it's going to take a while, sadly, and it's a huge hit to the sports industry. But yeah, I think things are going to change.
And Mark, if I can, put on your old baseball cap as a former major leaguer, what do you see as the future of sports, at least in the next year or so, baseball or otherwise?
Yeah. So today the NCAA announced that many of the sports programs at the universities that they can start practicing after June 1st of this year. I'm very nervous about that. As Michelle said, there are contact sports, and then there's sports like golf or like baseball where you don't have that same physical connectedness that you do, when you're in rugby and you're in a scrum. So I think that you're going to have to look at it. You're going to have to do it slowly. Major League Baseball is trying to figure out how they can put together a season, so that and maybe without any fans in the stadiums, to keep the players separated, to have them tested daily, and so on, just to try and do it. But I don't know how basketball comes back. I don't know how football comes back. Because of the potential spread. So I know we all miss it. It's not that much fun watching the World Series from 23 years ago or something like that. But, they're trying the best they can. But I think it's going to take a little more time. And, what happens when one team, somebody gets, there's a chance that before you know about it, the rest of the team could have been infected. So,
well, I'm always happy to watch Red Sox or Patriots championship victories. So I'll keep watching those.
You said the White Sox, right?
We must have had a technical difficulty there.
But
Great.
Maybe this is the rise of technology, because I've been, the America's Cup is a big thing for New Zealand. And one of the things I've been experiencing as part of the future technology is virtual reality, where you are, because now they can put VR 360 cameras in the events. And so you fully immerse yourself, and maybe the future of sport and spectatorship as we know it, this is the time for it to change. This is where you get to be on the pitch and see the ball, or be on the boat, or all the other things. So it's not necessarily a bad time. Maybe it's a time of transition to a technology.
Well, I will start loosening my arm just in case. But Dr. Michelle Dickinson, Ambassador Mark Gilbert, I want to thank you very, very much. A fascinating conversation. It went very quickly. It's really been a terrific way to take a look at the pandemic and how New Zealand has responded to it. And really want to thank you for participating in the session. This has been Dorothea Green Lecture Series from Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here in Miami. I'm David Kramer. Thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.